The storm that changed everything. When Ethan Cole pulled that bloodied heiress from the twisted wreckage on Highway 9, he had no idea he was about to collide with a destiny that would shatter every assumption about love, worth, and what it truly means to save someone. One storm, one choice, two worlds that should never have met. Tonight I'm sharing a story that proves sometimes the most unlikely rescues happen when we least expect them. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of unexpected love has traveled across the world. The windshield wipers of Ethan Cole's battered Ford pickup fought a losing battle against the torrential rain hammering down on Highway 9. Each swipe revealed only more sheets of water cascading from the October sky, turning the asphalt into a treacherous mirror that reflected his headlights back at him in a dizzying dance of light and shadow. "Come on, old girl," Ethan muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the truck's engine coughed like an old man with too many cigarettes behind him. "Just get me home to Lily." The digital clock on his dashboard glowed a harsh green, 11:47 p.m. Another 16-hour shift at Morrison's auto plant had finally ended, but the overtime pay would cover Lily's school supplies for next month. At 8 years old, his daughter deserved better than hand-me-down everything, even if it meant Ethan running himself ragged to provide it. The radio crackled with weather warnings that he'd already memorized. Flash flood watch, high winds, stay off the roads if possible. But if possible was a luxury that single fathers working double shifts couldn't afford. The bills didn't care about storms, and neither did the rent. Lightning split the sky ahead, illuminating the winding mountain road in stark, brilliant white. For a split second, the world looked like a photograph, negative, everything reversed, alien wrong. Thunder followed immediately, so close that Ethan felt it in his chest, rattling through his ribs like a physical presence. He'd driven this route 1,000 times over the past 3 years, ever since Sarah's accident had left him alone with Lily and a mountain of medical debt that still kept him awake at night. Every curve, every pothole, every mile marker was burned into his memory. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar road seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, as if the storm had somehow altered the very geography of his world. The heater wheezed warm air that smelled faintly of antifreeze and broken dreams. Ethan reached for his coffee cup, cold now bitter dregs that matched his mood, and took a sip that made him grimace. Gas station coffee at midnight tasted like regret and necessity. His phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A text from Mrs. Rodriguez, Lily's babysitter. "She's sleeping soundly. Sweet dreams about the school play tomorrow. Drive safe, mijo." Ethan's heart clenched with the familiar guilt that shadowed every long day. Lily had been practicing her lines for weeks, reciting them at breakfast, during dinner, even in her sleep. She was playing a sunflower in the third-grade production of The Garden of Dreams, a small part that she treated like she was headlining Broadway. "I'll be the tallest sunflower ever, Daddy," she'd announced last week, stretching her skinny arms toward the ceiling of their tiny apartment. "Mrs. Peterson says sunflowers always face the sun no matter what, just like how I always face you when you come home." The memory brought a smile to Ethan's weathered face, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd worn all day. Lily had a way of finding magic in the mundane, hope in the hopeless. She was his sunflower, always turning toward whatever light she could find, even when their world felt perpetually overcast. Another flash of lightning, this one so bright it hurt his eyes. In that frozen moment of illumination, Ethan saw something that made his heart stop. Metal. Twisted metal gleaming silver against the dark bulk of an oak tree. His foot hit the brake before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. The truck skidded on the wet asphalt, hydroplaning for terrifying seconds before the tires found purchase again. Ethan's hands fought the wheel as the vehicle fishtailed, coming to a stop sideways across both lanes. His hands shook as he reached for his cell phone, speed dialing 911, while his eyes strained through the rain-soaked windshield. The emergency line rang once, twice. "This is dispatch. What's your emergency?" "There's been an accident on Highway 9 about 15 miles north of Cedar Falls. A car hit a tree. I think someone might be hurt." "Sir, are you injured? Are you able to approach the vehicle safely?" Ethan was already opening his door, cold rain instantly soaking through his work shirt. "I'm fine. I'm going to check on them now." "Sir, I need you to stay on the line. Emergency vehicles are en route, but with this storm it may take some time. Can you see the occupants of the vehicle?" The wind nearly tore the phone from Ethan's hand as he stumbled across the slick road toward the wreckage. Up close, the scene was even worse than he'd imagined. What had once been a gleaming luxury sedan, he thought it might be a BMW, though it was hard to tell with the front end wrapped around the massive oak like a metallic embrace, was now a study in violent physics. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, mixing with the rain to create an eerie fog that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. The driver's side door hung open at an impossible angle, and that's when he saw her. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, slumped unconscious against the deployed airbag. Blood matted her dark hair to her forehead, and her breathing was shallow, labored. She wore what looked like an expensive evening dress, black silk that was now torn and stained, and diamond earrings that caught his flashlight beam like captured stars. "I can see her," Ethan reported into the phone, his voice steadier than he felt. "Young woman, unconscious, head injury. She's breathing, but it doesn't look good. Sir, do not attempt to move her unless the vehicle is in immediate danger of fire or explosion. Check for fuel leaks, but do not—" The acrid smell of gasoline hit Ethan's nostrils, sharp and dangerous. His flashlight beam found a growing pool of liquid beneath the rear of the car, rainbow slick in the LED glow. "There's a fuel leak," he said, his pulse spiking. "I have to get her out. Sir, wait for emergency personnel." But Ethan was already pocketing the phone. He'd worked around cars long enough to know that gasoline plus electrical shorts plus heat equaled disaster. The woman's breathing was getting shallower, and that pool of fuel was growing larger by the second. "Hey," he said softly, reaching through the mangled door frame to touch her shoulder. "Can you hear me? I'm going to help you, okay?" Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. Up close, he could see the full extent of her injuries. The gash on her forehead was deep, probably requiring stitches, and there was blood on her lips that suggested internal damage. But she was young, and her pulse when he checked her wrist was steady, if weak. Ethan had never moved an accident victim before, but 3 years of single parenthood had taught him that sometimes you had to act first and worry about the consequences later. Very carefully, he slipped one arm under her knees and another behind her shoulders, supporting her head and neck as much as possible. She was lighter than he'd expected, or maybe adrenaline was making everything seem easier. As he lifted her from the wreckage, she stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips that might have been a word or might have been just pain. The rain had turned his truck into a temporary ambulance. Ethan laid her across the bench seat, using his work jacket as a pillow and the emergency blanket from his glove compartment, a remnant from his more optimistic days when he'd thought he might go camping again to keep her warm. Her eyes opened as he was checking her pulse again, dark brown and unfocused, but aware. She tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. She started, then coughed, wincing at the pain. "What happened?" "You were in an accident," Ethan said gently, pulling out his phone to update the dispatcher. "Try not to move too much. Help is on the way." She blinked slowly, her gaze moving around the interior of his truck, taking in the worn upholstery, the child's drawing taped to the dashboard. Lily's latest masterpiece, a family portrait where everyone had purple hair, the stack of overdue bills stuffed into the cup holder. "You pulled me out," she said, and it wasn't a question. The car was leaking gas. It wasn't safe. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition that seemed to cost her significant effort. "You don't know who I am." Ethan frowned. "Should I?" For the first time since he'd found her, she almost smiled. "No," she whispered. "I suppose you wouldn't." The distant wail of sirens cut through the storm, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights began to strobe through the rain, painting the scene in alternating colors of urgency. "They're here," Ethan said, but when he looked back at her, her eyes had closed again. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of paramedics, police officers, and questions. Ethan found himself repeating the same story over and over. He'd been driving home from work. Saw the accident, called 911, pulled her from the car because of the fuel leak. Simple facts that somehow felt inadequate to describe the strange intensity of the experience. "You did the right thing," the lead paramedic told him as they loaded the woman into the ambulance. "That car went up about 10 minutes after we got here. If you hadn't gotten her out when you did..." Ethan watched the ambulance disappear into the storm, its red lights fading like dying embers. The police had taken his statement, the tow truck had hauled away what remained of the luxury sedan, and now he stood alone on the empty highway, with rain still drumming against his shoulders. His truck started on the third try, the engine coughing its familiar protest, before settling into its usual rough idle. As he drove the remaining miles home, Ethan couldn't shake the image of those dark brown eyes, the way she'd looked at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He'd saved someone's life tonight. The thought should have felt significant, heroic even. Instead, it just felt like something that needed doing, like working overtime, or fixing Lily's bicycle, or any of the 1,000 small acts of necessity that made up his days. The apartment complex where he and Lily lived was quiet, most of the windows dark. Ethan climbed the external stairs to their second-floor unit, his work boots heavy on the metal steps. Mrs. Rodriguez had left a note on the kitchen table. "Lily ate all her dinner, even the vegetables. Homework is done. She's excited about tomorrow. You're a good father, Ethan. Sleep well." Ethan crumpled the note, gently adding it to the shoebox, where he kept all of Mrs. Rodriguez's encouraging messages. On nights like this, when exhaustion weighed heavier than hope, those little pieces of paper were proof that he wasn't completely failing at the one job that mattered most. Lily's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and he peered through the gap to check on her. She lay sprawled across her twin bed, arms flung wide like she was trying to hug the entire world in her sleep. Her costume for tomorrow's play hung carefully on the back of her chair, a bright yellow dress with green fabric leaves that Mrs. Rodriguez had helped them sew on last weekend. "My sunflower," Ethan whispered, pulling her blanket up to her chin. She stirred slightly, mumbling something about sunshine and stages, before settling back into deep sleep. In his own room, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed and finally allowed himself to process what had happened. He could still smell the gasoline, still feel the weight of the unconscious woman in his arms, still see those diamond earrings catching the light like tiny pieces of a life he couldn't imagine. She'd been wearing clothes that probably cost more than he made in a month, driving a car that was worth more than his annual salary. Whatever world she came from, it was as far from his as the storm clouds were from the stars they hid. But in that moment, when she'd opened her eyes and looked at him, none of that had mattered. She'd just been someone who needed help, and he'd been someone who could provide it. The math was that simple, that clear. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor. "Heard about the accident on 9. You okay?" "Fine," he typed back. "See you tomorrow." Tomorrow. Another shift, another day of trying to build something resembling security from the rubble of circumstances he couldn't control. But tonight, for the first time in months, Ethan fell asleep thinking about something other than bills and exhaustion. He dreamed of lightning and dark brown eyes of sunflowers that grew tall enough to touch the storm clouds, and of a voice whispering, "Thank you," in the darkness between thunder and dawn. Outside, the storm finally began to fade, leaving behind only the gentle sound of rain against the windows and the promise of morning light that would reveal whatever the night had changed. In a few hours, Lily would wake up excited about her school play, Mrs. Rodriguez would arrive with her usual maternal efficiency, and Ethan would begin another day in his carefully constructed routine. But something fundamental had shifted in those moments on Highway 9. Like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples of that chance encounter would spread outward in ways that Ethan Cole, single father and overtime hero, could never have imagined. The woman with the diamond earrings and the expensive dress was somewhere in a hospital bed, probably receiving the kind of medical care that his insurance would never cover. Their worlds would return to their separate orbits, spinning through space at distances measured in dollars and social strata, and all the invisible barriers that kept people like him from people like her. Or so he thought. Because Ethan didn't know yet that some storms don't just change the weather, they change everything. He didn't know that gratitude could be a force more powerful than gravity, or that sometimes the most unlikely connections are forged in the space between lightning and thunder. He didn't know that Isabella Grant, heir to a fortune built on steel and ambition, was lying in a hospital bed thinking about purple-haired stick figures and work jackets that smelled like honest labor, and a man who'd risked his life for a stranger without asking for anything in return. He didn't know that tomorrow would bring more than just Lily's school play, that the phone call he'd receive would crack open his carefully ordered world like lightning splitting the sky. All Ethan knew as sleep finally claimed him was that he'd done what needed doing. He'd pulled someone from the wreckage and delivered them safely to help. In his world, that was enough. In his world, that was everything. But Isabella Grant's world operated by different rules entirely, and she was about to teach him that sometimes when lightning strikes, it illuminates more than just the darkness. Sometimes it reveals a completely different way to live. The morning sun streamed through the hospital room's Venetian blinds, casting geometric patterns across Isabella Grant's face as consciousness slowly returned. Her head throbbed with each heartbeat, a percussion section that seemed determined to remind her that she was very much alive despite the twisted metal and shattered glass that should have been her tomb. The private room at Cedar Falls Memorial was a stark contrast to the luxury she was accustomed to: generic beige walls, standard-issue furniture, the persistent smell of disinfectant that seemed to seep into everything. But for the first time in years, Isabella felt oddly at peace. No assistants hovering with schedules, no board members demanding her attention, no grandfather's portrait glowering down at her from gilded frames. "Miss Grant." A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, and an expression of professional concern. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Isabella replied, then winced as the movement aggravated her headache. "Though I suppose it was actually a tree," and the nurse, her name tag read Patricia, smiled as she checked Isabella's vitals. "Your guardian angel is quite the hero. That man who pulled you from the car saved your life. The vehicle caught fire not 10 minutes after the ambulance arrived." Guardian angel. The phrase echoed in Isabella's mind as fragments of memory began to piece themselves together, strong arms lifting her from twisted metal, a voice speaking gently through the storm. Work clothes that smelled like honest labor and morning coffee. Dark eyes that had looked at her without recognition, without the calculating assessment she'd grown accustomed to seeing in everyone who knew her name. "The man who helped me," Isabella said carefully. "Is he still here?" "Oh no, dear. He left with the police after giving his statement. Blue-collar type, drove an old pickup truck. Probably had to get home to his family." Patricia adjusted Isabella's IV line with practiced efficiency. "Not everyone can afford to stick around hospitals, you know." The casual dismissal in the nurse's voice sparked something defensive in Isabella's chest, though she couldn't quite articulate why. She'd grown up in a world where people were categorized and cataloged based on their utility, their net worth, their connections. But last night, in the middle of a storm, none of that had mattered to the man who'd risked his life for a stranger. "I need to find him," Isabella said, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure your insurance company will handle any liability issues, dear. Try to rest. Dr. Morrison will want to run a few more tests before we can think about discharge." But Isabella was already reaching for her phone, grateful that the paramedics had thought to retrieve her purse from the wreckage. Her assistant Marcus answered on the first ring, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Isabella, thank God you're all right. I've been fielding calls all morning. Your grandfather is beside himself. The board is demanding a statement, and there are reporters camping outside your apartment building. We need to control this narrative before—" "Marcus," Isabella interrupted, her voice still hoarse but firm. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it quietly." "Of course, anything. What do you need?" "Last night a man pulled me from the wreckage. I need to find him. His name is—" Isabella paused, realizing she didn't even know his name. "I don't know his name. But he was driving an old Ford pickup, probably lives in the Cedar Falls area. Blue-collar worker, probably has a family." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Isabella wondered if the call had dropped. "Marcus?" "I'm here. Isabella, I understand you're grateful, but perhaps a monetary reward channeled through the proper legal— No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "This isn't about liability or public relations. I need to thank him properly. Personal, not corporate." Marcus sighed, a sound she recognized as his preparing to argue tone. "Isabella, you've just been through a traumatic accident. Perhaps when you're feeling better we can arrange something appropriate through Marcus." Isabella's voice carried the steel that had built her family's empire. "Find him. Use whatever resources you need, but keep it discreet. I don't want media attention on this man or his family." "Of course. I'll have something for you by this afternoon." 3 hours later, Marcus called back with information that painted a picture Isabella found both heartbreaking and oddly inspiring. His name is Ethan Cole, 29 years old, single father to an 8-year-old daughter named Lily. He works at Morrison's auto plant, has for 3 years, ever since his wife died in a car accident. Good employment record, no criminal background. Lives in the Cedar Point. Apartments on Elm Street. Quite frankly, Isabella, he's exactly what he appears to be, a working man trying to make ends meet. Isabella stared out the hospital window at the small town spread below her. She'd grown up in a world where everyone had an angle, where kindness always came with a price tag attached. The idea that someone might risk their life for a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do felt almost foreign. What about his financial situation? Struggling from what I can determine. Medical debt from his wife's illness, living paycheck to paycheck. His daughter attends public school, they rent a 2-bedroom apartment. He works overtime whenever it's available. The picture Marcus painted was so far removed from Isabella's experience that it might as well have been describing life on another planet. She tried to imagine what it would feel like to worry about rent, to work 16-hour shifts, just to keep the lights on, to measure your success in terms of school supplies and grocery bills rather than quarterly earnings. "I want to meet him," Isabella said suddenly. "Isabella, I really don't think, not as Isabella Grant, heiress to Grant Industries, just as someone who wants to say thank you." "That's impossible. Your face has been in Fortune magazine, the Wall Street Journal. There's no way you could meet him without—" "Then I'll figure out a way." The plan that began forming in Isabella's mind was simultaneously simple and completely insane. But as she sat in that sterile hospital room surrounded by the trappings of a life that had begun to feel more like a beautifully appointed prison, idea of stepping outside her gilded cage felt like the first real breath she'd taken in years. 2 days later, Ethan Cole was getting home from another double shift when he found the envelope slipped under his apartment door. His name was written on the front in elegant handwriting, but there was no return address, no postmark. Inside was a simple note: "Mr. Cole, I would very much like to thank you in person for saving my life. If you're willing, please meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Murphy's Diner on Main Street. I'll be the woman in the blue coat. IG." Ethan read the note 3 times, trying to process the implications. She'd found him somehow, tracked him down to his apartment. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead he found himself oddly curious about the woman with the diamond earrings who'd looked at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "Daddy, who's the letter from?" Lily appeared at his elbow, still wearing her sunflower costume from the school play that afternoon. The performance had been a triumph. She'd remembered every line, beamed through every song, and taken her bow like she was accepting an Oscar. "Just someone I helped the other night," Ethan said, tucking the note into his pocket. "How was the play?" Lily launched into an animated recap of the afternoon's events, complete with dramatic reenactments and detailed descriptions of every costume, every song, every moment of what she clearly considered her theatrical debut. Ethan listened with the practiced attention of a father who'd learned that the small moments were often the most important ones. But even as he made dinner and helped Lily with her homework and read her bedtime story, his mind kept returning to the note. The handwriting was educated, expensive, the kind of penmanship that came from private schools and careful cultivation. But the message itself was simple, direct, almost humble. The next afternoon found Ethan standing outside Murphy's Diner, second-guessing his decision to come. The diner was a Cedar Falls institution, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. If he was meeting the woman from the accident, their conversation would be the topic of discussion for weeks. He almost turned around twice before finally pushing through the door. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon grease welcomed him, along with the low hum of conversation from the lunch crowd. Most of the faces were familiar. Murphy's drew the same crowd of retirees, shift workers, and local business owners day after day. But sitting in a corner booth, wearing a simple blue coat and looking oddly nervous, was a woman who definitely didn't belong to Cedar Falls' usual demographic. Isabella looked up as he approached, and Ethan felt the same strange recognition he'd experienced on the storm-soaked highway. Without the blood and the rain and the urgency of the moment, he could see that she was beautiful in a way that seemed almost too polished for the real world. But her eyes held the same vulnerability. He remembered the same gratitude that had seemed so out of place with her expensive clothes. "Mr. Cole." She half rose from her seat, extending a hand. "I'm Isabella. Thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, direct, but Ethan could feel the slight tremor that suggested she was more nervous than she appeared. He slid into the booth across from her, noting that she'd already ordered coffee black, like his own preference. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Isabella said, wrapping her hands around her mug like she needed the warmth. I almost didn't. Ethan studied her face, looking for some clue about what she wanted from him. You went to a lot of trouble to find me. I needed to thank you properly. What you did, pulling me from that car, she paused, seeming to struggle with words. I'm alive because you were willing to risk your own safety for a complete stranger. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Isabella said quietly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and waited for help to arrive. You didn't hesitate. The conviction in her voice surprised him. She spoke like someone who'd thought deeply about human nature, who'd perhaps been disappointed by it more often than not. The car was leaking gas, Ethan said simply. There wasn't time to wait. Isabella smiled, and for the first time since she'd sat down, she looked genuinely relaxed. You make it sound so simple. It was simple. You needed help, I could provide it. End of story. Is it the end of the story? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that Ethan wasn't sure he understood. He found himself studying her more closely, noting details that the storm had hidden. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably mid-20s, with intelligent eyes and an elegant way of holding herself that spoke of breeding and education. But there was something else, something that seemed almost lonely, despite her obvious advantages. I don't know what you're looking for, Ethan said finally. If it's about money or insurance or... It's not about money. Isabella's response was quick, almost defensive. I wanted to meet the man who saved my life, to understand what kind of person does what you did. I'm not complicated, Ethan said with a slight smile. I work at the auto plant, I raise my daughter, I pay my bills when I can. That's about it. Your daughter. Isabella leaned forward slightly. How old is she? 8, Lily. The name brought its usual warmth to Ethan's voice. She was in a school play yesterday, actually. Played a sunflower. Sunflower. Isabella's expression softened. That's lovely. Does she look like you? Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling to his favorite picture of Lily, taken last weekend at the park, her face scrunched up in concentration as she tried to blow a dandelion clear of seeds in one breath. She's got her mother's eyes, he said, handing over the phone. But my stubborn streak, according to my neighbor. Isabella studied the picture with an intensity that surprised him. She's beautiful, she said softly. She looks happy. She is, most of the time. Ethan took the phone back, noting how Isabella's fingers lingered on the device for just a moment too long. Kids are resilient, more than adults sometimes. Her mother, you mentioned she passed away. The question was gentle, careful, but Ethan still felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of Sarah. Car accident. 3 years ago, Lily was 5. I'm sorry. Isabella's voice carried a weight that suggested she understood loss more personally than her privileged appearance might suggest. That must have been hard, Ethan finished. But you do what you have to do. Lily needed me to figure it out, so I did. Isabella nodded slowly, as if she was processing more than just his words. You make it sound so straightforward. Choosing to be strong. There wasn't really a choice. When someone depends on you, you don't get the luxury of falling apart. Something shifted in Isabella's expression, a recognition that seemed to cost her effort. You're right, she said quietly. I suppose I've never thought about it that way. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the background noise of the diner filling the space between them. Ethan found himself oddly curious about this woman who'd sought him out, who asked questions like she was trying to solve a puzzle she'd never encountered before. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course. That night when you were in the truck, you said I didn't know who you were, like I should have recognized you." Isabella's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. "Did I say that? You were pretty out of it, but yeah, made it sound like you were famous or something." "Not famous exactly." Isabella set down her mug carefully. "More like recognizable in certain circles." "What kind of circles?" For a moment, Ethan thought she wasn't going to answer. Isabella stared out the diner's window at the quiet street beyond her expression, cycling through emotions he couldn't read. "Business circles," she said finally. "My family. We own some companies. People in that world tend to know who I am." It was clearly an oversimplification, but Ethan didn't push. Everyone had parts of their life they preferred to keep private, and he was hardly in a position to judge anyone for maintaining boundaries. "Must be nice," he said instead. "Having that kind of security." Isabella's laugh was short, bitter. "Security is one word for it." The response intrigued him, but before he could ask what she meant, Isabella was checking an expensive watch that probably cost more than Ethan made in 6 months. "I should go," she said, but made no move to leave. "I'm sure you need to get back to Lily." "She's at school for another hour," Ethan said. "And I don't start my shift until 6. You work nights." "Sometimes. Depends on what's available. Overtime pays better and you need the money." Isabella's voice held no judgment, just understanding. "Yeah, I need the money." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with something internal. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "Mr. Cole, Ethan, what if I told you there was a way to change that, to not have to worry about overtime shifts and medical bills and whether you can afford school supplies?" Ethan felt his defenses rising. "I'd say that sounds like the beginning of a conversation I don't want to have." "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Ethan's voice sharpened. "Because in my experience, when someone starts talking about easy money, it's usually not as easy as they make it sound." Isabella raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "You're right. I'm sorry. I hate seeing good people struggle when there are resources available to help. I don't need charity." "I know you don't." Isabella's response was immediate, certain. "What you did for me wasn't about charity or expectation of reward. It was just decent human kindness. But that doesn't mean you have to suffer because you're too proud to accept help." Ethan studied her face, trying to read the motives behind her words. There was sincerity there, but also something else, a kind of desperate earnestness that suggested this conversation mattered to her in ways he didn't understand. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why does this matter to you?" Isabella's composure cracked, just slightly, revealing something vulnerable underneath. "Because," she said quietly, "I've been surrounded by people my entire life who would step over a stranger to protect their own interests. You literally pulled a stranger from a burning car without knowing anything about her except that she needed help. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" The raw honesty in her voice caught Ethan off guard. This wasn't the polished woman who'd walked into the diner. This was someone struggling with concepts that should have been simple but apparently weren't in her world. "Maybe you're spending time with the wrong people," Ethan said gently. Isabella's smile was sad. "Maybe I am." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before sliding it across the table. "That's my number," she said. Not my business number, my personal cell phone. If you ever need anything at all, please call me. And I mean that, Ethan. Anything. Ethan picked up the card, noting that the front was elegantly simple, just a name and phone number, no company logo or title. The back had a number written in the same careful handwriting as the note. "I'm not looking for a handout," he said carefully. "I know, but maybe I'm looking for something I can't buy." Isabella stood pulling on her coat, with movements that seemed suddenly urgent. "Thank you for meeting me, Ethan. And thank you again for saving my life." She was halfway to the door before Ethan called after her. "Isabella." She turned back, hope flickering across her features. "For what it's worth," Ethan said, "you seem like good people, too." The smile that spread across Isabella's face was radiant, transforming her from merely beautiful to something approaching luminous. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the echo of a conversation that felt far more significant than its surface would suggest. Ethan sat in the booth for another 10 minutes, turning the business card over in his hands and trying to process what had just happened. The woman who'd sought him out was clearly wealthy, educated, probably connected to circles of power and influence that were as foreign to him as life on Mars. But underneath all that polish and privilege, she'd seemed almost hungry for the kind of simple human connection that he took for granted. He thought about Lily, about the bills stacked on his kitchen counter, about the constant calculations that governed his daily life, whether to buy groceries or pay the electric bill, whether to take Lily to McDonald's or save the money for her school field trip. The idea that Isabella's offer might provide a way out of that endless juggling act was tempting in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. But Ethan had learned through hard experience that there was no such thing as free money, and help from strangers, especially wealthy strangers, usually came with strings attached that weren't visible until you were already tangled up in them. Still, as he walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Ethan found himself thinking less about Isabella's money, and more about her eyes, the loneliness he'd glimpsed beneath her composed exterior, the way she'd looked at Lily's picture like she was seeing something she'd never encountered before. Lily was waiting for him when he got home, bouncing with excitement about her day at school and full of questions about where he'd been. "I had coffee with the lady from the accident," Ethan explained as they started dinner together. "The one you saved." Lily's eyes went wide. "Is she okay? Was she pretty? Did she say thank you?" "She's fine. Yes, she was pretty, and yes, she said thank you many times." "Good." Lily nodded with the serious authority of an 8-year-old who'd given the matter significant thought. "Mrs. Rodriguez says when people help you, you should always say thank you. It's good manners." "Mrs. Rodriguez is right." "Daddy." Lily's voice carried the careful tone she used when she was building up to an important question. "Yeah, sweetheart. If the lady wanted to be friends with us, would that be okay?" The question caught Ethan off guard. "Why do you ask?" Lily shrugged, but her expression remained serious. "You don't have many friends, Daddy. Just work friends and Mrs. Rodriguez. And she's really more my friend than yours." The observation stung because it was accurate. Since Sarah's death, Ethan's world had contracted to work Lily and the handful of necessary interactions that kept their small family functioning. He'd told himself it was about priorities, about focusing on what mattered most. But Lily's innocent question forced him to acknowledge that maybe it was also about fear. Fear of letting people close enough to hurt him again, fear of opening their carefully balanced life to variables he couldn't control. "If she wanted to be friends," Ethan said carefully, "we could think about it." Lily's smile was brilliant. "Good. I think you should have more friends, Daddy. You get lonely sometimes, even when you think I don't notice." That evening, as Ethan tucked Lily into bed and listened to her prayers, which included specific requests for blessings on her daddy Mrs. Rodriguez, her goldfish Charlie, and the pretty lady who daddy helped, he found himself reconsidering Isabella's offer not from the perspective of pride or independence, but from the viewpoint of a man who was perhaps more isolated than he'd wanted to admit. The business card sat on his nightstand, the numbers catching the light from his bedside lamp. Whatever Isabella Grant was offering, it represented a door to a world he'd never imagined entering. But as Ethan turned off the light and settled into sleep, he realized that what intrigued him most wasn't the promise of financial security. It was the possibility that somewhere in that world of wealth and privilege, there was a woman who looked at acts of simple human kindness like they were miracles, who seemed to value authenticity more than advantage, and who might be just as lonely in her gilded world as he was in his practical one. The rain that had brought them together was just the beginning of the storm that was about to reshape both their lives. The next few days passed with Isabella's business card burning a hole in Ethan's wallet, like a constant reminder of possibilities he wasn't sure he should explore. He found himself pulling it out at odd moments during his lunch break at the plant, while waiting for Lily's school bus in the quiet hours after she'd gone to bed, when the apartment felt too small and the future felt too uncertain. Thursday evening brought the kind of minor crisis that had become routine in Ethan's carefully budgeted life. Lily's backpack zipper had finally given up after months of faithful service splitting apart, just as she was getting ready for school and spilling her books across the apartment floor. "Daddy, I can't go to school with a broken backpack," Lily announced with the gravity of someone facing a genuine catastrophe. "Tommy Martinez will make fun of me again." Ethan knelt beside her, examining the damaged zipper with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to fix everything that could be fixed and make do with everything that couldn't. This particular break was beyond his repair skills, and they both knew it. "We'll get you a new one this weekend," he said, though the promise felt hollow even as he spoke it. $25 for a decent backpack meant $25 not available for groceries or the electric bill. "Really?" Lily's face lit up with hope. "One of the good ones like Emma has with the sparkly unicorn?" Ethan's heart clenched at the innocent request. Emma Morrison was the daughter of the plant manager, and her sparkly unicorn backpack probably cost more than Ethan made in a day. But Lily didn't understand the mathematics of their life, the constant calculations that governed every purchase, every decision. "We'll see what we can find," Ethan said, which was his standard response when no felt too harsh, but yes was impossible. Lily's expression dimmed slightly, the way it always did when she recognized that particular tone. At 8 years old, she'd already learned to read the difference between promises her father could keep and hopes he couldn't afford. "It's okay, Daddy," she said, with the kind of mature acceptance that broke Ethan's heart. "Mrs. Rodriguez has some big rubber bands. Maybe we can make it work." That night, after Lily had gone to bed, clutching her broken backpack like a wounded pet, Ethan sat at his kitchen table surrounded by bills and calculations that never seemed to add up the way he needed them to. The numbers stared back at him with mathematical indifference: rent due in 6 days, electricity past due, grocery money that would have to stretch another week. He could pick up extra shifts, but that meant less time with Lily, and he'd already missed her school play practice because of overtime. He could ask for an advance on his paycheck, but that would put him further behind next month. Every solution created new problems, every choice carried costs he couldn't afford. Isabella's business card lay on the table beside the bills, her handwritten phone number. A potential answer to problems that felt increasingly impossible to solve on his own. But accepting help from someone he barely knew felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he should cross, opening a door he might not be able to close again. The decision made itself Friday afternoon when Lily came home from school, with tears streaming down her face and her broken backpack held together with duct tape and determination. "What happened, sweetheart?" Ethan knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed against his work shirt. "Tommy Martinez said my backpack looked like trash," Lily hiccuped. "He said poor people always have broken things, and that's how you know they don't matter." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, rage and helplessness warring in his chest. He wanted to march to the school and explain to 8-year-old Tommy Martinez exactly what he thought of children who'd learned cruelty from adults who should have known better. But he also knew that Tommy was just repeating words he'd heard elsewhere, reflecting attitudes that Ethan's pride couldn't change and his poverty couldn't escape. "You matter," Ethan said fiercely, holding Lily tighter. "You matter more than anything in this world, and don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." "But he's right about our things being broken," Lily whispered. "Everything we have is old or broken or not as good as what other kids have." The truth in her observation cut deeper than any insult could have. Ethan had worked so hard to shield Lily from the realities of their financial situation, but an 8-year-old's world was full of comparisons, full of markers that announced status as clearly as billboards. That evening after Lily was asleep, Ethan pulled out Isabella's card and stared at the numbers for a long time before finally dialing. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying a note of surprise and something that might have been relief. "Ethan, is everything okay? I'm sorry to call so late." He began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "It's not late. I was hoping you'd call." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that made Ethan's decision feel less like surrender and more like possibility. "You said if I needed anything." He started, then stopped again, the words catching in his throat. "I meant it," Isabella said softly. "Whatever you need, Ethan, just tell me." So he did. He told her about Lily's backpack and Tommy Martinez's casual cruelty. He told her about the bills on his kitchen table and the calculations that never worked out. He told her about the choice between groceries and electricity, between Lily's happiness and his pride. Isabella listened without interruption, without judgment, without the patronizing sympathy he'd learned to expect from people who'd never had to choose between necessities. "Can I see you tomorrow?" she asked when he'd finished. "There's something I'd like to show you and someone I'd like you to meet." "Isabella, I don't want charity. I know you don't. But will you trust me just for one day?" Something in her voice made Ethan pause. There was an urgency there, a need that seemed to have little to do with his problems and everything to do with hers. "Okay," he said finally. "Where? I'll pick you up at 10. And Ethan, bring Lily." Saturday morning brought crisp autumn air and the kind of blue sky that made everything seem possible. Ethan and Lily waited outside their apartment building, both dressed in their best clothes, which weren't much, but were clean and carefully pressed. "Is that her?" Lily whispered, as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The car was understated, but obviously expensive, the kind of vehicle that whispered, rather than shouted, about its owner's wealth. Isabella emerged from the driver's side wearing jeans and a simple sweater that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, but looked casual enough to put them at ease. "You must be Lily," Isabella said, approaching with a smile that seemed genuine rather than polite. "I've heard so much about you." Lily stepped slightly behind Ethan, suddenly shy in the presence of someone who moved with the kind of confidence that money and education provided. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, his hand gentle on his daughter's shoulder. Isabella is the lady I helped the other night. The one from the accident. Lily's eyes widened. You're really pretty. Daddy said you were pretty, but I thought maybe he was just being nice. Isabella laughed, a sound of pure delight. Thank you. And you're every bit as beautiful as your picture suggested. Daddy showed you my picture. Lily emerged from behind Ethan, curiosity overcoming shyness. He did. And he told me you were in a school play. A sunflower, right? Lily's face lit up. I knew all my lines and everything Mrs. Peterson said. I was the best sunflower she'd ever seen. I'm sure you were. Isabella's attention was completely focused on Lily, without the distracted air that many adults adopted when talking to children. Maybe you can tell me all about it while we drive. The destination turned out to be 20 minutes outside Cedar Falls, in a part of the county Ethan had driven through, but never explored. The landscape shifted from industrial to rural, to something that could only be described as pastoral rolling hills dotted with horses, perfect white fences that seemed to stretch for miles, houses that were too grand to be called homes, and too elegant to be called mansions. Where are we going? Ethan asked, beginning to feel out of his depth. To meet someone special, Isabella replied, turning onto a tree-lined drive that led to a property that looked like something from a magazine. The house that emerged from the autumn maples was stunning in its understated elegance, 3 stories of weathered brick and climbing ivy with tall windows that caught the morning light and a wraparound porch that invited long conversations over sweet tea. Gardens surrounded the structure like a living frame, perfectly maintained, but natural enough to seem effortless. This is where you live, Lily breathed, her nose pressed against the window. This is where I grew up, Isabella said, and something in her voice suggested the distinction was important. An older woman emerged from the house as they pulled up the circular drive, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her clothes expensive but practical. She moved with the kind of graceful authority that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge, but her face lit up with genuine warmth when she saw Isabella. Bella, darling, the woman called, embracing Isabella with obvious affection. You look tired. Are you eating enough? I'm fine, grandmother. Isabella's voice carried the patient exasperation of someone who'd had this conversation many times. I want you to meet some friends of mine. Ethan felt suddenly self-conscious, as Isabella's grandmother had clearly the kind of woman who'd been born to wealth and raised to wielding it responsibly, turned her attention to him and Lily. This is Ethan Cole and his daughter Lily, Isabella said. Ethan is the man who saved my life. The older woman's expression shifted immediately, warmth replacing polite curiosity. Mr. Cole, she said, extending her hand with dignified grace. I'm Margaret Grant. I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you did for my granddaughter. Ma'am, Ethan replied, accepting her handshake and noting that her grip was firm and her eyes were sharp with intelligence. And this lovely young lady must be Lily. Margaret knelt to bring herself to Lily's eye level, a gesture that spoke of experience with children and genuine interest in their thoughts. Isabella tells me you're quite the actress. Lily nodded solemnly. I was a sunflower. Sunflowers always face the sun no matter what. How wise, Margaret said seriously. I think sunflowers might be the smartest flowers in the garden. As they walked toward the house, Ethan found himself processing details that painted a picture of wealth beyond anything he'd imagined. The gardens alone probably employed a team of professionals. The cars in the circular drive represented more money than he'd see in a lifetime. This wasn't just comfortable living, this was generational wealth, the kind of money that shaped legislation and influenced markets. Isabella, he said quietly, falling into step beside her, while Margaret and Lily engaged in animated conversation about flowers and gardens ahead of them. What aren't you telling me? Isabella's expression tightened slightly. What do you mean, Xiaozu? This place, your grandmother, that business card, with no company name, you're not just successful, are you? You're seriously wealthy. Does that change anything? The question was loaded with more weight than it should have carried, as if his answer mattered in ways that went beyond politeness or social climbing. I don't know, Ethan said honestly. Maybe. Probably. Isabella stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression of barely controlled desperation. What if I told you it doesn't matter? What if I told you that money complicates everything it touches, and for the first time in my life, I've met someone who doesn't see dollar signs when they look at me? Then I'd say you might be giving me too much credit. Or you might be selling yourself short. They'd reached the house where Margaret was showing Lily a garden filled with the kind of roses that appeared in coffee table books about English estates. But Ethan's attention was focused entirely on Isabella, on the vulnerability he glimpsed beneath her composed exterior. Why are we here, Isabella, really? Because, she said quietly, I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what I'm hoping for. The interior of the house was exactly what Ethan had expected, beautiful, expensive, and meticulously maintained. But it was also comfortable in a way that spoke of generations of family life, of children playing in these rooms, and adults gathering for holidays and celebrations. This wasn't a museum of wealth. It was a home where money had been used to create rather than to impress. Margaret led them to a sunroom filled with plants and comfortable furniture, the kind of space where important conversations happened over good coffee and homemade cookies. She disappeared briefly and returned with refreshments that included chocolate chip cookies that made Lily's eyes widen with delight. Mr. Cole, Margaret said, settling into her chair with the grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Isabella has told me something of your story. I understand you're a single father working in manufacturing. Yes, ma'am. Morrison's auto plant. And your daughter is 8. Yes, ma'am. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Raising a child alone must present considerable challenges. Ethan glanced at Isabella, wondering where this conversation was leading. We manage. I'm sure you do. But managing and thriving are different things, aren't they? The observation was gentle but pointed, delivered with the kind of directness that suggested Margaret Grant was accustomed to getting to the heart of matters without wasting time on pleasantries. Mrs. Grant, Ethan said carefully, I appreciate your hospitality, but if this is about charity, it's not. Margaret's interruption was firm but not unkind. This is about opportunity, Mr. Cole, and perhaps about saving my granddaughter from a life that's slowly suffocating her. Isabella's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down too quickly. Grandmother, no Bella. It's time someone said what needs to be said. Margaret's attention returned to Ethan. My granddaughter is 26 years old, brilliant, capable, and completely miserable. She has everything money can buy, and nothing that money can't touch. She sits on the boards of 5 companies, manages a charitable foundation, worth more than most countries' annual budgets, and hasn't had a genuine friend since boarding school. Grandmother, please. She called me 3 days ago and talked for 2 hours about a man who pulled her from a car wreck without asking her name, her net worth, or what she could do for him in return. For the first time in years, she sounded alive. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Lily, oblivious to the undercurrents, had discovered a collection of art books and was absorbed in pictures of paintings that probably cost more than most people's houses. What are you suggesting? Ethan asked finally. I'm suggesting, Margaret said, that perhaps you and my granddaughter might have more to offer each other than either of you realizes. Isabella stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This isn't how I wanted to do this. Then how did you want to do it? Margaret's voice was gentle, but relentless. Continue meeting in diners and pretending you're someone you're not. String him along with vague offers of help while you figure out how to explain that your personal net worth could probably buy his entire town. That's not what I was doing. Then what were you doing, darling? Isabella's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment Ethan could see past the polish and breeding to the young woman underneath, someone struggling with forces she couldn't control, trapped by advantages that felt more like prisons. I was trying to figure out how to tell someone that I'm falling in love with him without scaring him away with everything I represent, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. The admission hung in the air like a challenge, raw and honest and completely unexpected. Ethan felt his world shift slightly on its axis, all his assumptions about Isabella's motives suddenly requiring recalibration. Isabella, he started. Don't. She held up a hand, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Don't say anything yet. Just let me explain. She moved to the window, looking out at gardens that represented a lifetime of privilege and security. I've been proposed to 7 times, she said quietly. 5 business arrangements disguised as romance, 1 genuine fortune hunter, and 1 man who actually loved me but couldn't handle the pressure of what dating me meant for his life. Ethan found himself listening with an attention that felt almost physical, as if her words were reshaping something fundamental in his understanding of who she was. I've never met anyone who looked at me and saw just Isabella, someone who would risk their life for me without knowing my name, who would sit in a diner and talk about their daughter without calculating what I might be able to do for them. She turned back to face him, her composure completely gone now. You make me feel normal, Ethan. Like I'm worth saving for reasons that have nothing to do with my bank account. You are worth saving, Ethan said softly. Anyone would have. No. Isabella's interruption was fierce. Anyone wouldn't have. I've tested that theory more times than I care to admit, and most people see a price tag before they see a person. Margaret had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood the stakes involved. Now she spoke into the charged silence with the authority of someone accustomed to facilitating difficult conversations. Mr. Cole, may I ask what you're thinking? Ethan looked around the room at the obvious wealth, at Isabella's tear-bright eyes, at Lily absorbed in art books that cost more than his monthly salary, at Margaret, waiting for his response with the patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating complicated human emotions. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that this is more complicated than I know how to handle. Most worthwhile things are, Margaret observed. I'm thinking that Isabella is beautiful and intelligent and could have anyone she wants, and I'm a single father who works in a factory and drives a truck that's older than some high school students. Those are facts, Isabella said quietly, not judgments. I'm thinking that Lily deserves better than to have her father involved with someone whose world is so different from ours that we'll never really fit. And what if Lily's father deserves someone who sees his worth regardless of his bank balance? Isabella countered. Isabella. What if the money doesn't matter? Margaret added gently. What if what matters is whether 2 people can make each other happy, whether they can build something together that's stronger than what they could build apart? Ethan looked at Lily, still absorbed in her art books, her broken backpack, forgotten on the floor beside her chair. He thought about the bills on his kitchen table, the constant calculations that governed their life, the way his daughter had learned to temper her hopes to match their reality. You're asking me to believe in fairy tales, he said finally. I'm asking you to believe in possibility, Isabella replied, I'm asking you to let me show you that money is just a tool and what matters is how you choose to use it. And what if I can't? What if I can't get past the difference between us? Isabella's smile was sad but understanding. Then we'll have tried, and I'll have had the experience of knowing someone who saw me as worth saving rather than worth owning. Margaret stood smoothing her skirts with practiced grace. Perhaps this is enough heavy conversation for one morning. Lily, darling, would you like to see the horses? Lily's head snapped up from her art book eyes wide with excitement. You have horses, 3 of them, and I think they'd very much like to meet a sunflower. As Margaret led Lily outside, chattering excitedly about horses and riding, and whether sunflowers knew how to pet animals, Isabella and Ethan found themselves alone in the sunroom, with its expensive furniture and charged atmosphere. I'm scared, Ethan admitted quietly. Of me. Of what you represent. Of changing Lily's life in ways I can't predict or control. Of letting myself want something I might not be able to keep. Isabella moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume and see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. What if I told you I'm scared too? Of what? Of wanting something real so badly that I'm willing to risk everything I've been taught matters. Of falling in love with a man who might decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth. Of having to choose between the life I was born to and the life I want to build. They stood facing each other in a room that represented generations of wealth and privilege, 2 people from completely different worlds, trying to figure out whether the distance between them could be bridged by something as simple and complicated as love. What happens now? Ethan asked. Isabella's smile was tentative but genuine. Now we figure it out together. One day at a time, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time. And Lily gets a new backpack, and maybe she gets to see what it looks like when her father finds someone who makes him happy. Through the window, they could see Margaret and Lily in the garden, the older woman pointing out different flowers, while Lily listened with rapt attention. It was a picture of the kind of life Ethan had never imagined for his daughter, surrounded by beauty and possibility, where dreams weren't limited by practical considerations. The backpack was never really about the backpack, was it? He said. No. It was about giving you a reason to call me. It was about opening a door to a conversation we both needed to have. And the money, the foundation, the companies, all of it. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, watching her grandmother and his daughter through the window. The money is real, and it's a responsibility I take seriously. But it's also been a wall between me and everyone I've ever tried to care about. You're the first person who's made me want to tear down that wall instead of hiding behind it. Ethan thought about the choice ahead of him, the safe, predictable life he'd built for himself and Lily versus the uncertainty and possibility that Isabella represented. It was a choice between maintaining control and embracing change, between protecting what he had and reaching for what he wanted. I can't promise this will work, he said finally. I can't either, but I can promise that I'll never lie to you about who I am or what I want. And what do you want? Isabella's answer was simple, direct, and completely devastating in its honesty. I want to fall asleep next to someone who chose me for reasons that have nothing to do with my net worth. I want to wake up in a world where money is just a tool for building the life we want together. I want Lily to know that she's loved not just by you, but by someone who sees her the way you do, as precious beyond any calculation of worth. The weight of her words settled between them like a promise and a challenge. Outside, Lily's laughter carried on the autumn air, as Margaret apparently told her something amusing about horses and their opinions of sunflowers. One day at a time, Ethan asked. One day at a time, Isabella confirmed. And in that moment, standing in a room that represented everything he'd never had and everything he'd never thought to want, Ethan Cole made the choice to believe in possibility over probability, in hope over fear, in love over logic. It was the second time in a week that he'd chosen to rescue someone. This time he was beginning to suspect they might end up rescuing each other. The decision to trust possibility over fear felt monumental in that sunlit room. But the real test came in the weeks that followed, when the weight of their different worlds pressed against the fragile hope they'd built together. Isabella had insisted on starting small dinners at modest restaurants, afternoon walks through Cedar Falls' quiet downtown, simple moments that felt precious precisely because they were ordinary. But even simple moments carried complications when one person's idea of casual dining involved restaurants where Ethan checked prices twice before ordering, while the other had never considered cost as a factor in any decision. Isabella learned to suggest places that wouldn't make Ethan uncomfortable, while Ethan struggled with the knowledge that she was carefully managing their activities to accommodate his financial reality. "This is harder than I thought it would be," Ethan admitted one evening as they walked through Riverside Park after dinner at Mario's, a family-owned Italian place where the pasta was excellent and the prices were reasonable. "The dating part or the money part?" Isabella asked, her hand warm in his as they strolled past the playground, where Lily was making friends with two other children, whose parents sat on nearby benches, occasionally glancing their way, with curious expressions. "Both. Neither. I don't know." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her under the soft glow of a street lamp. "I keep waiting for you to realize this is too much work." Isabella's expression grew serious. "Too much work compared to what?" "Compared to men who see me as a business opportunity. Compared to relationships where every conversation is a negotiation and every gesture is calculated for advantage. Compared to someone who fits in your world." "What if I don't want to fit in my world?" Isabella's voice carried a frustration that had been building for weeks. "What if I want to build a new world, one where we don't have to choose between love and logic?" Their conversation was interrupted by Lily's delighted laughter as she conquered the monkey bars with the fierce determination she brought to everything she considered important. Watching his daughter play with children whose parents could afford the kind of clothes that never needed patching, Ethan felt the familiar weight of inadequacy that no amount of affection could completely dispel. "She deserves this," he said quietly, nodding toward Lily's happy face. "She deserves playmates who aren't worried about whether their shoes will last another month, birthday parties where the gifts aren't carefully budgeted weeks in advance. She deserves a father who's happy," Isabella countered. "She deserves to see what love looks like when it's not constrained by fear." That night, after tucking Lily into bed and listening to her excited recap of her playground adventures, Ethan found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of college brochures that Isabella had left behind. Not for him, though she'd mentioned several programs for working adults that offered evening classes, but for Lily. Schools with names like Hillcrest Academy and Riversea Preparatory, places where children learned languages and played instruments and never worried about whether their backpacks would hold together until Christmas. His phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Thank you for dinner. Thank you for letting me be part of your world. Thank you for wanting to be part of it." He typed back, then stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. The complexity of their situation crystallized the following weekend, when Isabella's business obligations collided with their carefully maintained bubble of normalcy. She'd been invited to a charity gala, the kind of event where tickets cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the guest list read like a Forbes magazine feature. "I have to go," Isabella explained over coffee at their usual table in Murphy's Diner, her voice carrying the resigned acceptance of someone bound by duties she couldn't escape. "It's the Children's Hospital Foundation annual fundraiser. I've been on their board for 3 years. "Then you should go," Ethan said, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of Isabella, in that world beautiful, sophisticated, surrounded by people who shared her background and her resources. "Come with me." The suggestion hung between them like a challenge neither was sure they wanted to accept. "Isabella, I know it's not your scene. I know it would be uncomfortable, but I can't keep living 2 separate lives, pretending you don't exist when I'm in that world, and pretending that world doesn't exist when I'm with you." Ethan thought about his single good suit purchased for Sarah's funeral and worn only twice since then. He thought about conversations with people whose casual references would be to places he'd never been, and experiences he couldn't imagine. He thought about Isabella on his arm, radiant in an environment where she belonged, while he counted the minutes until he could escape back to his familiar world of predictable struggles. "What if I embarrass you?" Isabella's expression shifted from hopeful to something approaching angry. "The only way you could embarrass me is if you believe that's possible. That's easy for you to say. You've never been the person who doesn't belong." "Haven't I?" Isabella's laugh was bitter. "Ethan, I've spent my entire adult life being exactly the person everyone expected me to be. I've smiled at men who saw me as an acquisition opportunity, made small talk with women who measured friendship in terms of social advancement, attended events where my value was calculated in terms of the donations I could generate." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to an intensity that made him forget they were sitting in a public place. "For the first time in my life, I want to show up somewhere as myself. Not as Margaret Grant's granddaughter or the Grant Industries heiress, but as Isabella, the woman who's falling in love with a man who pulled her from a car wreck because it was the right thing to do." The rawness in her voice convinced him in ways that logic couldn't. That Saturday evening found Ethan adjusting his tie for the 5th time, while Lily offered commentary and encouragement from her perch on his bed. "You look handsome, Daddy," she announced with the authority of someone whose opinion on such matters was final. "Isabella's going to think you're the most beautiful man at the party." "Handsome," Ethan corrected automatically. "Men are handsome, sweetheart." "No, beautiful," Lily insisted. "Mrs. Rodriguez says beautiful is about more than how someone looks. She says beautiful is about having a good heart and helping people." "You're beautiful, Daddy." The simple wisdom of an 8-year-old's perspective gave Ethan the courage he needed to face an evening that felt more daunting than any overtime shift he'd ever worked. Isabella arrived precisely on time, stepping out of her car, wearing a dress that transformed her from the woman he'd grown comfortable with into someone who besomanged in magazines and museum galas. The deep blue silk seemed to catch and hold light, while diamonds at her throat and ears reminded Ethan of the night he'd first seen her bleeding and unconscious, but still wearing jewelry that cost more than his annual salary. "You clean up well, Mr. Cole," she said with a smile that managed to be both elegant and mischievous. "You're stunning," Ethan replied, then felt heat rise in his cheeks at the inadequacy of the word. Lily appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with amazement. "Isabella, you look like a princess." "Thank you, sweetheart, but I think your daddy looks even better." The drive to the hotel where the gala was being held gave Ethan time to appreciate both Isabella's beauty and his own growing sense of being completely out of his element. The venue was downtown's most prestigious hotel, the kind of place where he'd driven past 1,000 times without ever imagining he'd walk through the front doors. Valet parking attendants in crisp uniforms took Isabella's keys with practiced efficiency while Ethan tried not to calculate how much those young men probably made in tips during a single evening like this. The lobby was all marble and crystal, filled with people who moved with the confident grace of those accustomed to luxury. "Second thoughts?" Isabella asked quietly, her hand warm on his arm. "Third and fourth thoughts," Ethan admitted. "Good. That means you're paying attention." The ballroom was a study in understated elegance, round tables draped in white linen centerpieces that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, and a silent auction display featuring items that represented the kind of lifestyle he'd only seen in movies. Isabella guided him through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing him to people whose names he recognized from newspaper business sections, and whose casual conversations referenced charitable foundations and international travel. "Ethan works in manufacturing," Isabella would say, and something in her tone made it clear that this was a point of pride rather than explanation. Most people were polite, though Ethan caught the subtle glances and careful assessments that suggested they were trying to place him in their social calculus. He was obviously with Isabella, obviously important to her in some way, but equally obviously not from their world. "And how did you two meet?" asked Patricia Whitmore, a woman whose jewelry could probably fund Lily's college education. "He saved my life," Isabella said simply, her hand finding Ethan's and squeezing gently. The conversation shifted after that, as conversations do when someone introduces an element that doesn't fit the expected social script. But Ethan noticed something else. Isabella seemed different here, more guarded, more careful with her words and her expressions. This was the version of herself she'd mentioned, the one who'd been trained to be exactly what others expected. Dinner was an elaborate affair involving multiple courses and more utensils than Ethan was entirely sure how to navigate. He watched Isabella discreetly following her lead while trying to contribute meaningfully to conversations that ranged from market volatility to vacation homes in the Hamptons. "I understand you're a single father," said the man seated to Ethan's left, a silver-haired gentleman whose name Ethan had missed during introductions. "Yes, sir. My daughter Lily is 8. "That must be challenging, balancing work and parenting responsibilities." Something in the man's tone suggested this was more than polite conversation, though Ethan couldn't identify the undercurrent. "We manage," Ethan replied carefully. "I'm sure you do. Children need stability, consistency. It's important that their lives aren't disrupted by uncertainty." Isabella's wine glass clicked against her plate as she set it down with slightly more force than necessary. "Uncertainty is part of life, Harrison. Some of us just have more resources to cushion the impact." Harrison Whitmore, Patricia's husband, and someone whose opinion carried weight in whatever circles Isabella moved in, smiled with the kind of condescension that wealthy people sometimes mistook for charm. "Of course, my dear. But there's a difference between normal life uncertainties and the kind of instability that comes from significant lifestyle changes." The meaning was clear enough that even Ethan caught it. Harrison Whitmore was suggesting that Isabella's involvement with someone from Ethan's background represented the kind of disruption that could affect a child negatively. "You know what's unstable?" Isabella's voice carried a crystalline edge that cut through the dinner conversation at nearby tables. "Growing up believing that your worth is measured by your net worth. Thinking that love comes with conditions and human value can be calculated in quarterly reports. Isabella dear." Lily Cole, Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger, "knows more about love, loyalty, and human decency than most adults in this room. She understands that what matters isn't what you own, but how you treat people. Her father has taught her that helping others isn't a tax deduction, it's a moral obligation." The table had grown quiet, other conversations pausing, as people sensed conflict, in the carefully orchestrated pleasantness of the evening. "That's admirable," Harrison said, his tone suggesting he found it anything but. "But surely you must consider the practical implications." "The practical implications," Ethan said, surprising himself by speaking up, "are that Isabella makes me want to be a better man, and my daughter has never been happier than she's been these past few weeks." He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of people who were trying to calculate his worth using metrics that had nothing to do with character or kindness. "I may not understand your world," he continued, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I may never be comfortable in places like this. But I understand Isabella. I understand that she's brilliant and generous and capable of changing lives just by choosing to care about them." Isabella's eyes were bright with unshed tears, though whether from gratitude or embarrassment, Ethan couldn't tell. "I also understand," he said, standing slowly, "that this probably isn't the right place for me." He was halfway to the door when Isabella caught up with him, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the hotel lobby. "Ethan, wait. I embarrassed you," he said without turning around. "You defended me. You defended us. Same thing in that room." Isabella moved to face him, her expression fierce despite the tears that had finally spilled over. "No, it's not. In that room, embarrassment means caring more about what they think than about what's right. You stood up to Harrison Whitmore. Do you have any idea how many people would kill for the chance to do that? Isabella, I've spent 10 years sitting at tables like that one listening to men like Harrison make pronouncements about what's appropriate and what's practical and what's best for everyone involved. Tonight was the first time I've ever seen someone tell them they're wrong." Ethan studied her face, looking for signs of regret or second thoughts. Instead, he saw determination and something that looked remarkably like relief. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we go home. We pick up Lily from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, and we sit on your couch and watch whatever movie she's chosen, and we remember why none of what happened in there matters. And tomorrow," Isabella's smile was soft but certain, "tomorrow we keep building our world. The one where love isn't a business transaction and worth isn't measured in dollars." They retrieved Isabella's car from the valet, leaving behind a gala that was probably still discussing their dramatic exit. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt like a journey between universes, from the rarefied air of charitable galas to the comfortable reality of working-class neighborhoods and families making the most of what they had. Mrs. Rodriguez met them at the door with her usual combination of maternal authority and barely contained curiosity. "Mijo, you look very handsome," she told Ethan, then turned to Isabella with frank assessment. "And you, querida, are even more beautiful than Lily described." "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. I hope Lily wasn't too much trouble." "Never. She helped me make cookies and told me all about the horses at your grandmother's house. That child has a good heart." Lily appeared in the doorway wearing her pajamas and an expression of sleepy contentment. "Daddy, did you have fun at the fancy party?" "We did," Isabella answered before Ethan could respond. "But we missed you." "I missed you too. Mrs. Rodriguez and I made extra cookies so you could have some when you got home." They spent the next hour in Ethan's small living room, eating cookies that were still warm from the oven, while Lily regaled them with stories about her day, and Isabella listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for board meetings and quarterly reports. "Isabella," Lily said, as they were cleaning up cookie crumbs, "are you going to marry my daddy?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge innocent, in the way that only children's questions could be, but loaded with implications that neither adult was quite ready to address. Why do you ask, sweetheart? Isabella replied carefully. Because you make him smile the way Mommy used to. And you look at me like I'm important, not like I'm just a kid who's in the way. Ethan felt his heart clench at his daughter's observation, at the casual way she'd revealed her awareness of how some adults viewed children as obstacles rather than people. You are important, Isabella said fiercely. You're the most important person in your daddy's world, and that makes you important to me too. But you didn't answer my question. Isabella glanced at Ethan, seeking guidance on how to navigate an 8-year-old's directness about topics they were still figuring out themselves. I'd like to marry your daddy, Isabella said finally. But marriage is something that happens when two people are sure they want to build a life together. We're still figuring out what that life might look like. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Well, when you figure it out, I think you should say yes. Why? Isabella asked, genuinely curious. Because Daddy's been sad for a long time, even when he smiles. But when you're here, he's not sad anymore. And you're not sad either, even though I think you were sad before you met us. The insight was devastating in its accuracy, cutting through adult complications to reach the simple truth underneath. Isabella had been sad, trapped in a life of obligation and expectation, surrounded by people who valued her for what she represented rather than who she was. And Ethan had been sad too, working so hard to provide for Lily that he'd forgotten to leave room for his own happiness. You're very wise, Isabella told Lily. I know, Lily replied with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own intelligence. Can I go to your grandmother's house again sometime? She said she'd teach me about the different kinds of roses. I think that can be arranged. Later, after Lily had gone to bed and Isabella was preparing to leave, they stood in Ethan's small kitchen talking quietly about the evening's events. I'm sorry about Harrison, Isabella said. He represents everything I hate about that world, the assumption that money gives you the right to judge other people's choices. He wasn't wrong about the instability part, Ethan pointed out. Dating you does change things for Lily, exposes her to possibilities that might not work out. And what if they do work out? Then she gets a life I never could have given her on my own. Isabella moved closer, her hand finding his face with the kind of gentleness that still surprised him. She gets a life where she's loved by two people instead of one, where she learns that families can be built on choice as well as biology, where she sees that love isn't limited by circumstances. And if it doesn't work out, then she learns that taking risks for love is worth doing, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. That some things are more important than security. Ethan leaned into her touch, allowing himself to believe for this moment, in this kitchen with this woman, that love might indeed be more powerful than logic. Harrison was right about one thing, he said quietly. What's that? I am going to change your life. Probably in ways you can't imagine. Isabella's smile was soft and certain. I'm counting on it. The kiss that followed felt like a promise and a commitment, like crossing a bridge they couldn't uncross. When they finally broke apart, Ethan realized that somewhere between the charity gala and the homemade cookies he'd stopped thinking about all the reasons their relationship couldn't work and started believing in all the reasons it could. Isabella, he said, as she gathered her coat and purse. Yes. Next time you have to go to one of those fancy events, maybe we skip the formal introduction and just meet for ice cream afterward. Her laughter was like music, bright and genuine, and completely free of the careful modulation she'd used at the gala. Deal, she said. But I reserve the right to occasionally drag you to places where you can see how the other half lives. As long as you remember that I prefer our half. Our half, Isabella repeated, testing the words, like they held special meaning. I like the sound of that. After she left, Ethan stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of an evening that had started in uncertainty and ended in something approaching hope. Cookie crumbs on the counter, wine glasses in the sink, the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with flour and vanilla. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications to navigate as they continued building a relationship that existed in the spaces between their different worlds. There would be more Harrison Whitmores, more moments when the gap between their backgrounds felt impossible to bridge, more questions about whether love was really enough to overcome practical realities. But tonight, in the quiet of his small apartment, with Lily sleeping peacefully in the next room, Ethan allowed himself to believe that sometimes the most unlikely love stories were also the most necessary ones. That sometimes rescuing someone from a car wreck was just the beginning of saving each other in ways neither could have imagined. He thought about Isabella's words at the gala, the way she'd defended him and Lily with a fierceness that spoke of genuine love rather than temporary infatuation. He thought about Lily's simple wisdom, her ability to see past complications to the essential truth of what was happening between them. Most of all, he thought about the choice that lay ahead, the decision to trust in possibility over probability, to believe that love could indeed build bridges across any divide, to have faith that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. The storm that had brought them together was just the beginning. The real weather they'd have to navigate was made of social expectations and financial realities of pride and fear, and all the ways that two people from different worlds could learn to create a new world together. But as Ethan turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom, he found himself looking forward to that challenge rather than dreading it. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was thinking about a future that included just survival. He was thinking about building something beautiful. The weeks following the charity gala brought a different kind of storm to their lives, not the dramatic crash of lightning and thunder that had first brought them together, but the steady, transformative pressure of two worlds slowly merging into something entirely new. Isabella began spending more time in Cedar Falls, trading her downtown penthouse for evenings in Ethan's modest apartment, learning to navigate the careful choreography of a life lived on a budget, while Ethan gradually accepted that love sometimes meant allowing someone to share burdens he'd carried alone for too long. The first real test came on a Tuesday evening in November, when Lily developed a fever that spiked to 103 degrees. Ethan's immediate instinct was to take her to the emergency room, but the math was brutal. Even with his insurance, an ER visit would cost more than he had in his checking account, and missing work the next day would compound the financial strain. Isabella found him in the kitchen at 11 p.m., staring at bills spread across the table while Lily slept fitfully in the next room, her fever finally broken thanks to children's Tylenol and cool washcloths. "Why didn't you call me?" Isabella asked, her voice tight, with something between hurt and frustration. "It's not your responsibility," Ethan replied, not looking up from the papers that represented his careful calculations of how much he could afford to care for his sick daughter. "Isn't it? When someone you love is suffering, when someone you care about is choosing between their child's health and their financial survival, isn't that exactly when you're supposed to call?" The word love hung between them, acknowledged but not yet formally declared, carrying weight that neither was quite ready to examine too closely. "Isabella, I can't." "You can't what except help? Allow someone to care about you and Lily without it being a transaction or an obligation." Ethan finally looked up at her, seeing the tears of frustration in her eyes, the way her expensive clothes looked incongruous in his kitchen with its second-hand furniture and carefully managed poverty. "I can't let myself get used to this." he said quietly. I can't let Lily get used to having problems solved with money she doesn't have. What happens when you realize this is too hard, too complicated, too much work? What happens when you go back to your world and we're left here except now we know what we're missing? Isabella sat down across from him, her hands folding over his, with the kind of deliberate gentleness that had become familiar over the past month. What if I don't go back? What if this is my world now? You can't mean that. Can't I? Isabella's voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. Ethan, 3 months ago, I was going through the motions of a life that felt like an elaborate performance. Board meetings where I said what was expected, charity events, where I smiled at people who saw me as a checkbook, with legs, dinners where every conversation was a chess match of social positioning. She gestured around his small kitchen, taking in the refrigerator covered with Lily's artwork, the second-hand table where they'd shared more honest conversations than she'd had in years of formal dining. This is the first place I've ever felt like myself. You and Lily are the first people who've ever made me feel like Isabella matters more than what Isabella represents. But your responsibilities, your family's business, will survive without me micromanaging every decision. My grandmother has been not so subtly suggesting that I need to find something that makes me happy rather than just something that meets expectations. Ethan studied her face, looking for signs of the impulsive romanticism that wealthy people sometimes mistook for genuine emotion. Instead, he saw the same determined certainty that had driven her to track him down after the accident, the same fierce loyalty she'd shown when defending him at the gala. What are you saying, exactly? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that had been building for weeks. I'm saying that Grant Industries has excellent management in place and doesn't need an heiress who'd rather be reading bedtime stories than reviewing quarterly reports. I'm saying that my trust fund is more than adequate to support whatever life we want to build together. I'm saying that I'd rather worry about Lily's fevers and your overtime shifts than spend another day pretending to care about stock options and market projections. You can't just walk away from your entire life. I'm not walking away from my life. I'm walking toward it. The conversation was interrupted by Lily's voice calling from her bedroom, weak but alert. They both went to her, finding her sitting up in bed with tangled hair and sleepy eyes, but no sign of the fever that had terrified Ethan hours earlier. Daddy, Isabella, I had a bad dream. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed while Isabella moved to the chair where she'd been reading when Lily first fell asleep. What kind of dream, sweetheart? I dreamed that you and Isabella had a big fight, and she went away and didn't come back. Ethan felt his heart clench at his daughter's unconscious articulation of his own deepest fear. Isabella's not going anywhere, Lily. Promise? Lily's attention was fixed on Isabella, waiting for an answer with the kind of serious expectation that 8-year-olds brought to matters of supreme importance. I promise, Isabella said, her voice steady and certain. I'm not going anywhere unless you and your daddy want me to go. We don't want you to go, Lily said immediately. Right, Daddy? Ethan looked at his daughter's earnest face, then at Isabella sitting in the second-hand chair beside Lily's bed, her expensive dress wrinkled from a night of caring for a sick child, her makeup worn off, and her hair escaping its careful styling. She looked more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, and more real than she'd ever looked in her perfect, polished world. No, he said quietly. We don't want you to go. Lily's smile was radiant. Good. Now will you both stay until I fall asleep? Sometimes when I'm sick, I get scared of being alone. They stayed, taking turns reading from a collection of fairy tales that Lily had memorized, but still insisted on hearing. Isabella's voice was soft as she read about princesses who chose love over duty, about ordinary people who became extraordinary through acts of kindness, about happy endings that seemed impossible until they weren't. When Lily finally drifted back to sleep, Ethan and Isabella found themselves alone in his living room, surrounded by the quiet evidence of their makeshift family. Lily's homework on the coffee table, Isabella's shoes kicked off by the front door, the comfortable disorder of people who'd stopped performing for each other. "I meant what I said," Isabella said quietly, "about not going anywhere. Even if it means giving up everything you've worked for." Isabella's laugh was soft but certain. "Ethan, what have I worked for? A corner office in a building my great-grandfather built, a seat on boards where my opinion matters only because of my last name, a social calendar filled with events where my value is measured in donation dollars." She moved closer to him on the couch, her hand finding his, with the naturalness that had developed between them. "I've spent my entire adult life managing wealth I didn't earn for purposes I don't always believe in. The only thing I've ever chosen, the only thing that's ever felt real is this: you and Lily and the life we could build together. It won't be easy. There will be people who think you're crazy for giving up your advantages. Let them think what they want. I'd rather be crazy and happy than sensible and empty." That conversation became the foundation for everything that followed. Within a month, Isabella had restructured her business interests, maintaining enough involvement to honor her family's legacy while freeing herself to focus on what she called investments in happiness rather than portfolio growth. The changes came gradually, organically, like seasons shifting from one to the next. Isabella found an apartment in Cedar Falls, modest by her previous standards but luxurious by Ethan's, close enough to his building that Lily could walk between them, but separate enough to allow their relationship to develop at its own pace. She began volunteering at Lily's school, discovering that her business experience translated surprisingly well to organizing fundraisers and managing educational programs. The other parents, initially wary of someone whose car cost more than their annual salaries, gradually warmed to her genuine interest in their children's welfare and her obvious adoration of Lily. "She's good for you, Mrs. Rodriguez observed one evening as she watched Isabella help Lily with a math assignment that had reduced both father and daughter to frustrated tears. "She makes you remember that you deserve to be happy." Ethan couldn't argue with the assessment. Isabella's presence in their lives had created space for joy he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Lily bloomed under the attention of someone who treated her thoughts and dreams as important, while Ethan found himself looking forward to the future in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death. But the most significant change came in February, when Lily announced that she wanted to enter the school's science fair with a project about renewable energy. "All the other kids are doing volcanoes and growing plants," she explained over dinner at Isabella's apartment, where they'd begun spending most evenings. "But I want to do something that actually matters." Isabella's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement Ethan had learned to recognize as the prelude to elaborate plans. "What kind of renewable energy?" "I don't know yet. Something that could help people like us, people who have to worry about electricity bills." The simple statement carried weight that resonated with all three of them. Lily's project became a family endeavor, with Isabella contributing research skills and resources, while Ethan provided the practical engineering knowledge that turned theory into working models. Their evenings were filled with discussions about solar panels and wind turbines, with trips to the library and hardware store, with the kind of collaborative learning that felt like play but produced genuine understanding. Lily's project, a small-scale solar charging station designed for low-income households, won first place at the school level and advanced to the regional competition. "She gets her intelligence from you," Isabella told Ethan, as they watched Lily explain her project to judges who were clearly impressed by both her knowledge and her passion. "She gets her confidence from you," Ethan replied. The belief that her ideas matter, that she can change things. She gets that from both of us. From seeing adults who believe in solving problems instead of just complaining about them. Lily's regional victory came with a scholarship opportunity that would cover her education through high school at one of the state's premier institutions. But when they told her about the scholarship, her reaction surprised them. "Will I still live with you and Daddy?" she asked Isabella, her expression serious. "Of course. The school has a bus route that includes Cedar Falls. And will I still see my friends from my regular school? We'll make sure of it," Ethan promised. Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "Okay, but I want to keep doing projects that help regular people, not just rich people." "We'll make sure of that too," Isabella said solemnly. The scholarship celebration became an engagement announcement when Ethan surprised Isabella and himself by proposing during Lily's acceptance speech. He'd been carrying his grandmother's ring for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive until Lily was talking about families that choose each other and love that builds bridges between different worlds. "Isabella Grant," he said quietly, dropping to one knee beside her chair in the school auditorium while their daughter beamed from the stage. "Will you marry us?" The inclusion of Lily in the proposal was deliberate, acknowledging that their love story had always been about more than just two people finding each other. Isabella's answer was everything Ethan had hoped for and nothing he'd expected. "Yes," she said through tears that caught the auditorium lights like diamonds. "Yes to both of you. Yes to building something beautiful together. Yes to choosing love over logic every single day." The wedding planning that followed reflected their merged sensibilities, Isabella's resources and connections, combined with Ethan's preference for meaningful over elaborate. They chose the garden behind Margaret Grant's house for the ceremony, the same space where Lily had first met the horses and learned that sunflowers always turn toward the light. "I want Mrs. Rodriguez to be my grandmother too," Lily announced during one of their planning sessions. "And I want Grandmother Margaret to teach her how to make those cookies that taste like heaven." The guest list became an exercise in bridging worlds, Isabella's family and social connections mixing with Ethan's co-workers and neighbors, people who'd never imagined they'd attend the same events, but who shared genuine affection for the couple at the center of the celebration. Harrison Whitmore sent his regrets along with an expensive gift that Isabella quietly donated to the local food bank. "Some people," she told Ethan, "need to learn that kindness isn't a weakness before they can appreciate love that doesn't come with conditions." The night before the wedding, Ethan found himself standing in the garden where the ceremony would take place, trying to process the magnitude of change that had swept through his life in less than a year. The man who'd pulled a stranger from a car wreck had somehow become someone preparing to marry into a world he'd never imagined entering. Having second thoughts, Isabella's voice came from behind him, soft in the spring darkness. "Third and fourth thoughts," he replied, echoing their conversation from months earlier. "But not about marrying you, about deserving this." Isabella moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his, with the naturalness that had developed between them. What if deserve has nothing to do with it? What if this is just what happens when two people choose to build something together instead of protecting what they have separately? Then I guess we'd better make sure we build something worth the risk. I think we already have. The wedding itself was everything they'd hoped for and nothing they'd expected. Lily walked down the aisle as their flower girl, wearing a yellow dress that made her look like the sunflower she'd played in her school production, carrying a basket of petals that she scattered with the kind of serious concentration she brought to all important tasks. Isabella's dress was simple but elegant, the kind of timeless beauty that came from perfect fit rather than elaborate design. But what took Ethan's breath away wasn't the dress or the setting or the flowers that Margaret had spent weeks perfecting. It was the expression on Isabella's face as she walked toward him, the absolute certainty that said she was exactly where she belonged. The vows they'd written together reflected their journey from strangers to lovers to family, acknowledging the storms they'd weathered and the ones they'd faced together. "I promise," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the garden, filled with people who'd become their chosen family, "to see you as Isabella first, and everything else second. To build our life on love rather than logic, hope rather than fear." "I promise," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the tears that caught the afternoon sunlight. "To choose our world over any world I was born into. To believe in possibility over probability, in building something beautiful rather than protecting something safe." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the garden erupted in celebration that felt both elegant and joyful, sophisticated and heartfelt. Margaret Grant and Mrs. Rodriguez sat together at the family table, comparing stories about their respective children and planning collaborative cookie projects. Ethan's co-workers mingled with Isabella's business associates, discovering common ground in their shared affection for a couple who'd proven that love could indeed bridge any divide. But the moment that captured the essence of their new life came during the father-daughter dance when Lily insisted that Isabella join them. "We're a family now," she announced to the assembled guests with 8-year-old authority. "And families dance together." As they swayed to music that spoke of love and hope and new beginnings, Ethan realized that the storm that had brought them together had done more than just change the weather. It had transformed the very landscape of what was possible. The reception lasted until the stars came out, filled with toasts that spoke of unlikely love stories and second chances of courage that came from choosing hope over fear, of families built on choice rather than obligation. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Ethan and Isabella found themselves alone in the garden, where they'd first begun to imagine a life together. "No regrets?" he asked, his arms around his wife as they danced to music that existed only in their hearts. "Only one," Isabella replied, her smile mysterious in the starlight. "What's that?" "I regret that it took a car accident to bring us together. I wish I'd found you sooner." Ethan's laughter was warm against her hair. "If you'd found me sooner, I wouldn't have been ready for you. I needed to learn how to be a father first, how to choose love over fear. And I needed to learn that wealth without purpose is just expensive emptiness." They danced in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the garden that had become symbolic of their ability to cultivate beauty together. "What happens now?" Isabella asked. "Now we go home. We tuck Lily into bed in her new room in our new house, and we start the complicated, wonderful work of building a life together. And tomorrow we keep choosing each other, every day in every way that matters." The house they'd bought together sat half-in between Cedar Falls and the Grant family estate, close enough to Margaret for regular visits, but far enough to maintain their independence. It was larger than Ethan's apartment, but smaller than Isabella's previous standards, with enough rooms for Lily to have her own space and for Isabella to maintain a home office for her scaled-back business interests. But the real measure of their success wasn't in square footage or property values. It was in the small moments that made up their daily life. Isabella learning to braid Lily's hair for school. Ethan teaching Isabella how to change the oil in her car. Family dinners where they planned weekend adventures and discussed Lily's latest school projects. 6 months after the wedding, Isabella started a nonprofit foundation focused on educational opportunities for children from low-income families, using her business skills and family connections to create programs that addressed practical barriers to academic success. Ethan left the auto plant to become the foundation's operations director, bringing his understanding of working-class challenges to bear on solutions that actually worked for the families they served. "We're not saving the world," Isabella told a reporter who interviewed them about the foundation's success. "We're just proving that when people with resources partner with people who understand problems, you can create opportunities that change individual lives. And when you change enough individual lives," Ethan added, "you do start to change the world." Their first Christmas as a married family brought snow that transformed their neighborhood into something magical, with Lily building snowmen while Ethan and Isabella watched from their kitchen window, coffee cups warm in their hands and contentment warm in their hearts. "Do you miss it?" Ethan asked, as they watched their daughter create snow angels with the kind of wholehearted joy that seemed to be her specialty. The excitement of high-stakes business, the adrenaline of making decisions that affect thousands of people. Isabella considered the question seriously, watching Lily's mittened hands shape snow into art. "I used to think that excitement was the same thing as purpose," she said finally. "I thought that big decisions automatically meant important decisions. But watching Lily discover her own capabilities, seeing families in our programs, achieve goals they never thought possible, knowing that our choices create space for other people's dreams. This feels like the most important work I've ever done. Even though it's smaller scale. Especially because it's smaller scale. Anyone can write a check, Ethan. Not everyone can show up for the daily work of helping people believe in their own possibilities." That evening, as they tucked Lily into bed and listened to her prayers, that included specific gratitude for Daddy finding Isabella in the storm and Isabella choosing to love us back, Ethan realized that their love story had become something larger than romance. It had become a proof of concept evidence that people from different worlds could indeed build something beautiful together, that love could overcome practical obstacles when supported by genuine commitment, that families could be created through choice as powerfully as through biology. "Lily's right, you know," Isabella said, as they settled into their own bed, the house quiet around them, and snow still falling outside their bedroom window. "About what?" "About you finding me in the storm. I was lost before that night, Ethan. I just didn't realize how lost until you showed me what it felt like to be found." "I found you," Ethan agreed, pulling her closer. "But you saved me right back. You and Lily both. You taught me that it's okay to want more than just survival, that love is worth risking everything for." Outside, the storm that had brought them together had long since passed, replaced by the gentler weather of everyday life, the steady rhythm of work and family, of small victories and shared challenges of love that deepened through choice rather than chance. But sometimes, on nights when the wind picked up and rain drummed against their windows, Ethan and Isabella would remember that first storm and the choice they'd made to rescue each other. They'd remember that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of kindness, that love often arrives disguised as crisis, and that the best families are built not on similarity, but on the decision to face life's storms together. In the morning, they'd wake up to Lily's laughter echoing through their home, to coffee that tasted better when shared, to the complicated, wonderful work of proving that love could indeed conquer all, not through magic or destiny, but through the daily choice to show up for each other, to build something beautiful from the raw materials of hope and determination, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth risking everything for. And when Lily asked, as she often did, to hear the story of how Daddy found Isabella in the storm, they'd tell her about the night when lightning showed them that sometimes the most important rescues happen when two people choose to save each other, creating families that shine like sunflowers, always turning toward the light, no matter what weather life brings their way. The end of their story was really just the beginning. The start of a lifetime spent proving that love, when chosen daily, and lived boldly could indeed weather any storm and build any bridge, creating possibilities as endless as a child's imagination and as durable as the decision to keep choosing each other one day at a time for all the days to come.